Hey guys, welcome back to Joe Yo. It's a podcast all about Johnston County history in central North Carolina, one of the original 13 colonies and 13 states. This is pretty much where we're going to be located in this episode and also in the next one, and what the heck Johnston County has to do with the Revolution. You know, we all hear a whole lot, if you're ever out from around here, a whole lot about Johnston County's role in the American Civil War, and that is true. There was, there's Bentonville, and there's how Sherman is going to occupy Smithfield briefly. But as I said in the last episode, I think Smithfield or Johnston County is not really recognized for its importance during the Revolution because it's pretty doggone big. And we're going to go more into that today, and to not hesitate any further, let me give you some background. We left off with last episode talking about taxation without representation, and it wasn't so much that colonists were so upset about the taxation portion, they were upset about the representation portion. Anybody that has ever studied any kind of government or anything realizes that you kind of got to have stuff, otherwise you don't have a country. You know, you've got to have some kind of central objective as a nation, or you don't really have anything. And to pay for some of the things that you really need to have, well, that's where taxation comes in. So people weren't really upset about the taxation portion. They were upset about their lack of being able to say anything about it or being able to shape that taxation. And whenever the people being taxed don't have a say-so on their taxation, they feel like things are just being imposed upon them. And that was their upset. That's why they were really upset. So we're going to jump into this thing, and we left off with a guy named Governor Josiah Martin, a famous lion kicker. He's replacing Governor William Tryon, the guy at the heart of the regulator conflict. So Josiah Martin was the governor that replaced him. He was not a politician. Now, William Tryon was a politician. He knew it wasn't so much about the rules and regulations. He knew it was all about making things happen. And Josiah Martin, on the other hand, was definitely much a rule follower and expected everyone to follow the same rules. So, let's just throw this out there. Throughout North Carolina's history, people have bought land. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the colony being established, is to have land, and many of them all the way back were absentee owners. This idea about people coming in and buying land and getting land and holding land and being, you had some of that definitely, but there were also a lot of people that bought land and owned land that didn't live here. They were speculators. And man, American history is full of land speculators thinking that if I have the money, buy up a whole bunch of land, and then they find some gold on it, that I'm going to make myself a killing, like stock market kind of stuff. Thomas Jefferson was one of the biggest land speculators there was, and so was George Washington. Even Ben Franklin was the one kind of dabbled in it. On the other hand, I will say that for Thomas Jefferson, his land speculation actually helped cause a war between North Carolina and Georgia, but that's a whole other conversation. But we have a lot of people in North Carolina that were absentee landowners. This is, again, like a trend in American history, this buying of land, just in case. Well, anyway, so in 1746, during the Gabriel Johnston administration, the Colonial Assembly decided that if an absentee landowner, which is someone that owns land in North Carolina but doesn't actually live here, if he had outstanding debt, the person that owed that debt could sue him. The person that he owed that debt to could sue him in the colonial courts, and a person's property could be seized to satisfy that debt. That makes sense. The problem is that North Carolina was a royal colony and technically was owned by the British monarchy. If the debtor was from North Carolina, that was no issue. No big deal. But debt of non-residents could mean that an upper court would have to be in control of the issue. See, So if landowner A in Johnston County owed land, or owed money to, say, a bank in Smithfield, and the guy doesn't pay his debt, well, then the person holding his debt, the person he owes money to, can seize his land, and it was all fine. And since it was contained within North Carolina, then it would be the property, the ownership, the court of North Carolina would oversee that. But our issue with the absentee landowners is that a lot of absentee landowners were actually in England or in other colonies. And North Carolina, as a separate colony, doesn't have any more rights to seize property or bring a person into court from Massachusetts. I mean, you don't have that right, that no more than we have a right to go and seize someone from another country, because that's how it was. Seize someone from another country and bring them here and take their stuff. It doesn't work that way. So a non-resident was not was not subject to the laws of another colony. Ownership of land doesn't really matter. Therefore, any debts of a non-resident of North Carolina that happened to own land in North Carolina would have to be settled in an English court, operated by England. There was no court of overall British North America. It didn't exist. And you would have things called admiralty courts that were up in Canada, but that was for other stuff. That would mean, therefore, if someone owed you money and they had land and they didn't live here, someone from altogether different place owed you money and you were from here, you could not get your debt realized. You could not get satisfaction of your debt by taking his property. That stuff was not, it couldn't happen. Now, it could happen, but that meant significant delays of what North Carolina residents saw as financial justice. Not to mention that many of those landowners were actually British. So, someone can owe you debt, have 5,000 acres of land, and never have to pay you. That's the problem. So from 1746 to 1770, the North Carolina courts treated land and debt satisfaction on the basis of land ownership, not residence. And there it stood. And in 1770, some new lawyers on the British Board of Trade spotted what they saw as an error and directed the new North Carolina governor to induce the Assembly, the General Assembly, our people, to amend this thing called the attachment clause. This is what the attachment clause was: attaching someone's land to a debt. And so the British Board of Trade told the new North Carolina governor, Josiah Martin, to make the Assembly amend this attachment clause or omit it from court practice altogether. Now, when Josiah Martin first arrived here, he did just that. He didn't really think anything of it, except that the attachment clause was wrong, and that the Colonial Assembly was thinking a bit more important than it was, and tried to convince the Assembly of the error that had held for 2 decades without being corrected before. And here was this new governor. He was correcting us and taking this right from us, because that's the thing. People in North Carolina had been doing that. They had been seizing property from other places. Even though you can't, it was happening. We were taking stuff, even though the British government said you couldn't do it. And so this Josiah Martin comes in and says, hey, you've got to obey the law. You can't just take people's property. And he was allowing outsiders to get away with something, not paying taxes when we have to pay them. And I think Governor Tryon did that. And who are you anyway, you new dude? No other colony was being told that they could not seize land from outsiders. We were being told that. Our new governor was telling us that. And they can all do it. And again, who are you anyway, Josiah Martin? Who are you coming in here telling us that we cannot get our debt satisfied? So Governor Martin and the North Carolina House tried to work toward a compromise, and everything had to be cleared with the Board of Trade in England. So 3 years after the arrival of Governor Martin in 1774, some people had had enough. And this is where, from previous episode, on August 12, 1774, Sam Smith of Smithfield and a bunch of Johnston County landowners had had enough, and they denounced taxation without representation. They demanded trial by jury for people accused of treason, because the people were talking out against how bad news this was. And some of the conversation they were having was, if these people from outside do not have to pay tax debt, meaning non-residents, then why do we have to pay tax debt? And if we do have to pay taxes, we should have actual representation in it, in making those laws, especially when there are some landowners who don't. They felt like in Smithfield it was an unjust system. This early protest was enough to put Smithfield in a somewhat honored position when the revolution started. See, Hillsborough had its regulator conflict. New Bern was the colonial capital. Fayetteville, sort of kind of placed itself in a position where it can claim capital status. But Johnston County had, here we are in 1774. That's not on any flag. But we're protesting here. So that same month in August, and seizing on some misinformation and propaganda about the governor seeking to subjugate North Carolina, the Speaker of the North Carolina House, again elected by us actually, John Harvey, he's from Provincial County, he had been calling for independence for a long time. Well, he decided to let a bill on the floor that would send delegates to a Continental Congress, a meeting of the colonies about concerns that the Crown was causing. Now, Governor Martin heard that this was on the agenda next, and so he refused to call the assembly into session. See, only he could call it a general assembly. He said, no, I'm not doing that. So then John Harvey of Provincial County, along with Smithfield's Richard Caswell and Smithfield's Benjamin Williams, along with others, decided to meet anyway, whether the new governor liked it or not. And they did so in New Bern on the 25th of August, 1774. Now, Richard Caswell is a landowner in Smithfield, and so is Benjamin Williams. And both those guys, Richard Caswell and Benjamin Williams, will later on become governor of North Carolina, both coming from Johnston County. And this meeting was 2 weeks after the protest in Smithfield, of which records indicate they both participated. So this new assembly was going to be called the First North Carolina Provincial Congress, even though Governor Martin said no. They decided to be far enough away from Governor Martin that he would not try to break in and break it up and use the Crown's army to stop them from meeting independently. To Governor Martin, these guys, Richard Caswell, Benjamin Williams, they were breaking the law in meeting because he has to call the meeting and he hadn't done so. And so they decided to meet far enough so he couldn't stop it. So they also want to make sure that they want to try to make it sure that when they met, it would be close enough for all representatives to come there really, really quickly, because it was important that we meet, because Governor Martin is like being ridiculous. So they did. Oh, and they also want to make sure it was, in a place that people kind of knew where it was. And given that Green's Path came right through Smithfield, and given that a lot of paths and roads came close to Green's Path, and the Neuse River was downriver upriver from New Bern, they decided to meet in Smithfield's courthouse at the site of the protest. Y'all, the very first provincial congress for an independent North Carolina, the Revolution, was called to be in Smithfield, North Carolina. It was going to meet in Smithfield's courthouse at the site of the protest. But as they got closer, they decided to take it right under the nose of the governor and dare him to stop them. So they got a little bit cheeky. They were going to make it here, but they said, you know what? Let him try to break it up, because we've had enough. So they decided to meet in New Bern, right under the nose, instead of Smithfield, right under the nose of Governor Martin. And there they decided to create something called the Provincial Council, which would effectively govern North Carolina, because obviously Governor Martin can't do that. Not that it mattered at this point, but Josiah Martin ran away. And he took refuge on a boat in the Cape Fear River after an alliance with who he hoped that he could ally with the Scots of the Sandhills, and that didn't work out. So this 13-person provincial council was going to be the government of North Carolina while we sorted out the mess of a incompetent, illegitimate governor, as they felt it, and the rising tide of revolution. This 13-person provincial council, its first meeting was in Johnston Courthouse in Smithfield. It was led by a man named Cornelius Harnett of New Hanover. You ever hear that name? This government was seated in Smithfield for its first few months, and the very first real North Carolina militia was organized in Smithfield in a hurry. And since the council was in Smithfield, most of the early recruits for the North Carolina militia were actually from Johnston County. And it was Johnston County residents that made up the bulk of the North Carolina militia that defeated the British at Moores Creek Bridge near Wilmington on the 27th of February, 1776. The British were going to try to come in and at Josiah Martin's request, put down this stuff that they were hearing about in Smithfield and New Bern. British came in to try to bring North Carolina back under British rule, but that same provincial council that we see that met Smithfield was the executive branch of the colonial government, and most of the people, a lot of the people that fought were Johnston County residents. Johnston County turned back Great Britain at Moores Creek Bridge. Not just Johnston County, but a lot of them. And so that will be part 2. Thank you for listening. See Smithfield, you are important. And it's not just a Civil War. If we have monuments for Civil War in Johnston County, we certainly should have some monuments for our Revolutionary War history. Somebody get on that. So, hope you enjoyed it. Smithfield's more important than what they even realize. And new episode coming up not too long from now. And hope y'all have a great day. Later.